Okay, so we've already explored the voxel workspace in 3D Coat, as well as many of the retopology tools you might typically use. And the next stage in this process is texture baking. What that entails is 3D Coat gathering all the color, specularity, and depth information from a voxel object here in the voxel workspace and projecting it onto our low polygon target using image maps. And those image maps will correspond with the UVs we have assigned to our model. Here you can see I have a single layer, which is the body, split into multiple UV maps, and that is so that I can get more texture resolution in the areas I think I'm going to need it. Whereas on the eyes, the teeth, and the tongue, I don't need quite as much, so I can actually place them on one UV map, and that's what I have here. Okay, so 3D Coat is going to send a copy of all these meshes over to the paint workspace, and it's also going to send the resulting image maps that were baked over to the paint room as well and assign them to paint layers. Okay, and we'll see how that works here shortly. The first major consideration is whether or not I even want to move everything to the paint workspace, because in some cases you may not necessarily want to do any texture painting. In 3D Coat, it makes most sense to merge to the paint room so that you can inspect the result. That way, if you need to make any changes, you can clear the objects and the paint layers in the paint workspace, come back to the retopper room, change your settings, and make another attempt if you need. With that in mind, that really is the most common method, going to the retopper menu and choosing one of these three major modes for the paint room. Now, the per pixel painting mode, it typically works with normal maps, but we'll see later how you can involve displacement maps as well. You also have micro vertex. This is the oldest method and still probably the best if you're working in a film, TV, or maybe a game cinematic project where you don't have to be quite as stingy with the polygon counts, and you're typically going to want to work with displacement maps or a combination of displacement maps and normal maps. PTEX is very similar to micro vertex, okay, where you're working with displacement, but it actually allows you to bypass the UV process here, and you can actually go in and brush select areas that you want to crank up the resolution or actually reduce it. So in that regard, it's very similar to live clay, but we'll look at each of these individually in the following videos. Okay, the next thing I want to point out is right here about midway through the menu under Bake Texture, you can elect to just simply bake all your textures out and send them to an external folder. For example, if you have a project folder with a subdirectory for textures or materials and so on, you could just point to that location, and you can elect to use this retopper mesh or an external mesh if you like. But again, the most common workflow is to merge everything to the paint room, mainly so that we can inspect the results here. Okay, so in this first video, what we're going to do is take a look at sequential texture baking. And the following video, we'll look at the bake scan settings, how you can make adjustments to fine-tune the baking result. Now, anytime you're ready to start the texture baking process, there are a few considerations to keep in mind. One is, as we've mentioned before, what mode do you want to work in? We've already discussed that in some detail, and we'll go in even further detail later on. But our next major consideration is dealing with issues that can arise whenever we bake multiple objects in our scene. Now, in any 3D application, when you are texture baking and you happen to be working with multiple meshes where you have objects that intersect, overlap, or occlude parts of another, then you are going to have scan errors, such as the eye area here. You'll have only partial coverage. Okay, so you're going to have a big spot on your image map that's blank just because it was occluded by the eyebrow and the rest of the head mesh. Same thing right here with the teeth. And a lot of times you can see kind of a white border where they touch. So you don't want your meshes touching one another or intersecting. In this case, obviously you can't get around that, so what we need to do is bake them separately. And that used to be very problematic up until about 1.5 to 2 years ago, because you literally had to make several baking attempts if you had multiple layers like this. But Andrew devised a new feature that created a new countermeasure for this particular issue. And what it does is it's going to look for a naming correspondence between your retopo mesh layer and your voxel layer. So for the body, I want it to bake separately, and then likewise with the tongue and the teeth. 3D Coat is going to bake these in an automated sequence for me so that I don't have to do this one by one manually. So it's going to save me a lot of time, but the lone requirement is that the names need to match exactly. Okay, so let's go to the retopo menu, and a little bit further down than about halfway, you have this Use Names Correspondence for Baking. So this is your Sequential Texture Baking. It's kind of hidden, but nevertheless, it's a very powerful feature, and you can check the naming, and it tells me that everything checks out. So let me go back to the menu here, and if you have just a single object or something like that, you can always just turn that off. Just check this only when you need it. In this case, we do want to utilize naming correspondence. Okay, so now we're ready to go. I'm going to decide to start off in per pixel painting mode, and this is the most common mode for working with game models. What I have here is a number of individual zones, and we'll cover this in the next video, but I selected individual areas and I created zones for them because I need changes only in these local areas. I don't necessarily need it across the entire model. So I want kind of a global setting for most of the model, but these zones allow me to make localized changes to the settings. I'll just hit OK. And whenever you are baking to per pixel painting mode, you'll get this dialog that asks, do you want to go ahead and take care of occlusion baking at this stage rather than later on in your texture painting stage? In this case, I might choose to go ahead and do it. Let's bring it down to maybe 10. Okay. And the next dialog I'll get is basically your import dialog, and it gives us a chance to set the texture sizes that we want to utilize, and also whether or not we want a subdivision. Now, don't be worried or concerned in this regard about initial subdivision. This just allows me to basically subdivide a few times for the object I'm sending to the paint room, but 3D Coat keeps or stores in memory this initial polygon state so that when I export, I have the opportunity to use this low polygon model here. Okay, so I'll just choose this first level subdivision. Keep the UV, obviously. And UV smoothing. I usually like to work with full UV set smoothing. And sometimes I'll check weld vertices, just in case. And then, as you can see, you have the different UV maps that we can set different resolution sizes to each one of them. So I'll choose 4K for the head, but this last map here, I'm going to actually change that to 2K instead of 4K. All right. So you see the progress bar, it may get to 100 and all of a sudden it'll switch back down to 5, 6, 50%, whatever, and that's because it's going, again, in the sequence. Typically, on a rather complex model with a sequential texture baking, it can typically take about a minute. In this case, it might take up to about 2 minutes, but there we are. You can see relatively about a minute and a half. Okay. And this allows us to zoom in. We can inspect the result. What I want to do, though, is sometimes our voxel object might be showing through, and it looks like we have errors, but it's not. It's just that again, you have basically your low polygon mesh and your voxel object taking up the same space, and so we don't want that. One way you could take care of this is to go to the view menu, and about 2/3 of the way down you have this option, show voxels in paint room, so you can see that overlapping here. So you can uncheck that so that all you see here is a low polygon mesh. The other way that you could handle that is have the Vox tree layer panel visible or docked in your workspace. Now, if you don't see this, I think by default it's not visible in the paint room, but you could always bring it into the paint room or any other room you like through the Windows menu under pop-ups, the Vox tree, and then just dock it here, and it will remain in your UI each time you come back. So here I could just simply click on the root layer, the little visibility icon, and I could hide it that way as well. Alright, and so the reason why you have voxels visible in this workspace is because you actually have vertex painting on a voxel model capability. So if you're not using vertex painting, you probably want to hide your voxel model at this stage in the process. Alright, so let me hit the W key for wireframe and we can see the result. So again, I have one subdivision level higher than what I had in the retopo room, but that just allows me to work with a little bit more detail on the mesh here in the paint workspace. And as I'll show later on, you can actually at this stage, even if you're working on a game model, if you want to create displacement maps here, okay, you can do that by creating a new layer, and then as you're painting your normal maps, 3D Coat is actually under the hood utilizing displacement. What we're seeing is normal maps, but 3D Coat is actually using displacement, and we can see when we check Show Displaced Mesh, the normal map detail actually being displaced in the viewport. And when we export, we can get displacement maps from that work. So again, we'll look at that here shortly as we go through these individual modes. So in the next video, we will retry this and go into the Bake Scan settings in greater detail. All right, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching.